Um, it's me, Uri, and this is episode one of what are we calling this? Chill but thorough reading guides. Emphasis: this is not a replacement to the actual book. This is more of like a gentle holding hand, which humbly will try and help you follow the reading of this book or give you a nice little introduction or kind of give like an overarching system of how the book is working. And these are all pretty much books that I love, books that I've wanted to study, that I'm in the process of studying. It's just coincidence that the idea of making this video coincided with the time that I thought it necessary for me to reread Lenin's Imperialism. So let's just freaking get off the rip. Um, Lenin's Imperialism was written while he was in Zurich. And he was a refugee because he was really cool and really smart. And they were like, yo, let's not let him live in Russia anymore. And this magazine hit him up like, yo, do you want to write an autobiography on Marx? And Lenin was like, probably strapped for cash because it's Switzerland. And he was like, yeah, let me write this little article. And so I know, as a diligent student that Lenin is, he's like, let me study Hegel, as Marx did. Let me try and get into the logic. And Lenin is reading this and he's fucking like, damn, Hegel's really cool, and Hegel's actually a materialist. He just got carried away by this concept of the absolute idea, but Hegel is really, like this really profound materialist, and his method of dialectics is insane. He writes Imperialism and State of Revolution, which are the two foundational works, besides all his other works, which are also fucking amazing. But State of Revolution and Imperialism are kind of this pre-Soviet Union boom, Kautsky diss tracks, let's freaking go, this is how the world works. And yeah, you can see this dialectical fluid motion, which always coincides with them being my favorite books to read, not by content but also just the way that it flows. For example, Capital Volume 1 has that flow. Wretched of the Earth has this flow. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, um kind of funny, Revolution of Palestine 36-39, they all have this flow to them where they're just expanding and expanding from their initial like root, and it all has to do with dialectics. And so then I kind of designed this crazy person looking graph of how I am trying to visualize it all connected and not segmented. um it's kind of gonna move a little bit like this, but you don't have to worry about that. I'll be carrying more of the talking. Feel free to wash some dishes, use this as a background track to anything you like to do, or take notes and accompany me on this beautiful study of Lenin, which studying always should be kind of a fun, engaging vibe. It's an adventure, not a physical one, but a maybe spiritual and mental one. But all right, let's start off. No more dilly dangling, or whatever they say. The first three chapters, specifically the first two, are origin stories. They're similar to Marvel or Euphoria season one. They work in the same way. But this one specifically, it's called "How the Many Became the Few," and it talks specifically about the two big players that we're going to see, which are businesses and banks. We starts with business, and in business, kind of from tip off the rip, says free trade through the process of accumulation, through its own contradictions, will become monopoly. Right? Boom. What a way to start off. What does he mean by that? In the mid 19th century, 40s to the 60s, even a bit of the 70s, we have mainly free trade, meaning these different companies are battling out in the market. Like who has the best product? The kind of preconceived notion that we have of capitalism, like the battle of the markets, who's gonna have the best product, the best price, etc., etc. But he says throughout time, throughout different people beating each other out, where it's gonna lead to accumulation. And what's going to happen is different companies are going to buy out different other companies. And with the ups and downs of capitalism, meaning the crashes and the booms, there's going to be a specific group of companies and people that are going to accumulate a lot of money and going to end up controlling the economy, which is kind of the opposite of this whole free trade thing. To give an example is, imagine if an industry has 20 or so different companies. Throughout time, through the process of accumulation and kind of that competition, it's really necessarily going to become one or two. And if it's two, they usually, as we'll see, these monopolies come to agreements, whether it's temporary, and consolidate their power before getting into each other. What does that look like? For example, in Germany, 0.9% was considered large scale enterprises, or 0.9% of the total concentration of companies. That 0.9% controlled 75% of the energy, of the production. They controlled 35% of the workforce, or employed 35% of the workforce, better said. And in some cases, these specific syndicates controlled 80% of the output of the industry, meaning that pretty much anyone that bought anything from like scissors from like the scissor industry was coming from this specific company, which is a huge amount of control, right? Because then, as we'll see, they can fix the prices, they can stagnate, etc., etc. Also, one thing that we see is combined enterprises. Maybe the scissor company is like, oh, let me also buy the plastic company, which makes the top part, and the metal. I clearly don't know a lot about scissors, but you know what I mean. And then they buy like the shipping shit, like where it's all gonna go. They control the different branches of the market. There's two ways of monopoly, which I've recently learned about, which Lenin doesn't really get into, but it's vertical and horizontal, right? Vertical, you control kind of pretty much the whole market, but then horizontal is like you control the different steps in the making of your product. So that way you don't have to get into trade. You pretty much control every step of the process, which is pretty insane. Cool. That's pretty much chapter one. Talks about more stuff, but I feel like that's the essence of it. Chapter two, pretty much same concept, but getting into banks. He says banks and business are kind of different form, but same content, right? Banks are seen as these modest intermediaries, which they used to be, which kind of like you go into, you drop your savings off, they might do some investment, and but through the same process as free trade became monopoly, these different banks all sparsed around get concentrated as well as accumulation and competition gets beat out. What happens? Most of these banks, the select few, control the majority of capital. In Germany, for example, in this instance, 83% of their capital of the country is controlled by a select few banks. What does that mean? Small banks are pushed aside, and same thing that we see with the companies. What's the bank's job? They transform inactive, meaning capital that's just sitting there, inactive capital, into active capital. Capital that's being used to produce more profit and consequently more capital, etc., etc. Capital that's moving, but it has to be employed by the industry in order for that really to be moving. And so then we kind of see this marriage of banks and industry. That's the first two chapters. We also see that a lot of banks get involved through a bunch of different businesses, through purchasing of shares, appointment of directors, and how six of these Berlin banks control 751 Berlin companies or German companies or different even companies, which is a huge amount controlled by just a select few. Lenin is like this marriage of bank and business is what we can call finance capital. What is finance capital? As we mentioned before, it's bank money capital controlled by the banks and employed by the industry. What does this mean? He kind of gives us a little trace through. We see concentration of production leads to monopolies arising, which leads to this merger of banks with industry, which really means the domination of financial oligarchy. As we said before, a select few control more and more of the economy. Lenin says the cornerstone for this way this system is working is what we can call the holding system. Holding system is pretty simple, it gets pretty intricate in the ways that it can work. The essence of the concept is we have parent company A, which purchases 51% of shares of B and 51% of shares of C, and they each cost 5 million. Lenin says you don't really need 51% to control a company, you really need like 40, but for the sake of this argument, we're going to say 51. B also controls D and E, C controls F and G, and etc. etc. For the argument, we're saying that each company controls two companies. We had an initial investment of 5 million plus 5 million, being 10 million, and through all these different companies, which are controlled indirectly by A ends up controlling, we can say, rough estimate, a control of 200 million euros, dollars, whatever the currency is, with an initial investment of 10 million, which we can see is without small investment, without having to break necessarily the bank, haha, they can control a lot of money and consequently can also transform all of that for their own benefit. Say G is a company that will help in the making of computers that A does in a different way. But the main thing that the monopoly does trickery with is through balance sheet juggling. The more money you have, the riskier your ventures might get in order to really kind of get the treasure, these kind of more idolized ways of making money. And so then they kind of like A will put in like 10 million into G to like for that G to control the industry. But then say that industry kind of falls off, A will sell G off for like a huge price before the shareholders know, and then G gets kind of ripped to pieces. In a very simple example, even if the industry is going to kaput, the monopolies, since they control the system, can find different ways of making profits without anyone knowing and by really screwing everyone else over. Lenin says these holding systems are ways for these companies to enter the international market, right? Not all of these companies are German or French or etc. etc. One example we see are the St. Petersburg banks. The banks in St. Petersburg are not controlled by any Russian bank, but they're really controlled in different proportions by the French, the German, and the English, which is in like a total of 8.4 billion rubles, which I believe is the Russian currency of the time. 40% of that total money is sent to these different syndicates, total of 6 in this case, kind of exemplifying the nature of what we're talking about, how the capital, controlled by the banks, is really then employed by industry, and banks really accelerates this process of accumulation and monopoly in order to strengthen their own home base. That's the first 3 chapters. It really kind of sets the ground of what's going on. I think to continue to understand what's going on later, I think it's important to have kind of a solid base of what these different players are and how they've evolved. I think it's important. The most important thing is not necessarily who they are now, but why it had to reach that point, through the contradictions of free trade and how the fundamental laws of capitalism brought it to this place. It's not something that can be fixed within capitalism, but is in the nature of capitalism itself that we reached this point. Amazing. Now we enter chapter 4, which is export of capital. If we read Marx, he's going to talk about a lot about the export of commodities, right? The exchange of commodities in the market. But since capital has reached such an accumulation in the small amount of countries, capital needs to be exported in order to make more profit. Also, because a lot of these countries, for example, France, Germany, there's not a lot they can get out of. They kind of have maximized as much as they can get. Have their agriculture is left to shit, which Lenin talks about a lot. And so they're like, we need to take over everything else, right? They do that in different ways. Lenin emphasizes form does not equate to content. So the content might be the same, but they might be doing it in different ways. In France, for example, we have their usurpers, I believe is the term is, pretty much loans. They give money to X country, and then it's returned with profit, and the money that they give is used to buy French products, and also it comes with a lot of terms like, oh, and now we can control your railroads, a lot of favors, etc. If you control the capital, you can kind of dictate how the things are going to go. In England, it's more control of colonies. It's more like, I think the best thing to do if you're reading Lenin's Imperialism, after that or before that or in between, however you prefer, is to read like Walter Rodney. like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa or Decolonial Marxism, or read like CLR James or Eric Williams, because it really gives the context of what Lenin is like, kind of like showing the economic facts, the reality, and how it was done. So, for example, an example I can put of this is English government goes in, the British government, and pretty much sells these lands, like expropriates the lands, take them over violently, and sells these lands, these huge terrains, for cents on the dollar to these huge companies. And so then it's really in the interest of extension of monopoly to have imperialism. They needs it because of the expansion that it needs. And we're going to see that later on. Exporters of capital are always the benefiters. As we mentioned before, whoever controls the capital can set the terms. And if everyone else, and because of the accumulation and the tendency and the law of accumulation, it's going to be a lot in a few hands and very little everywhere else. We can see this in a microcosm in a country, but we can also see this globally. Finance capital spreads itself everywhere. As we saw, it kind of needs to, if it wants to accumulate more, if it wants to control more, if it doesn't want to get left behind by the other international players such as the US, Germany, France, etc., whoever is their counterpart. What does that lead to? Leads to the division of the world. Imperialism sets the huge foundation, and now it's Walter White hitting Breaking Bad. He might have, I forget the show, but maybe he killed someone already, or like, he's being a fucking asshole to Skylar. This is division of the world. What is division of the world? One concrete example I can give is the Berlin Conference, where before World War One, the end of 19th century, these European countries sit in a fucking hall in Berlin and carve up Africa. And this is pretty much the prime example of what we're seeing here. But what is Lenin really saying? He's saying monopoly leads to and needs imperialism. The only reason imperialism exists, and you can see it correlated by the data that Lenin presents in the book, is that with the rise of monopoly, we see the rise of imperialism. As the export of capital increases, we have this formation of international cartels, these different companies from different countries working together to continue to expand. And what they really need is raw materials, right? They need to control the raw materials, because then they can control the source. They can make as much as they want, and they can dictate the prices and create what Lenin calls super profits, which are profits that are outside of the local sphere and are extracted from the outside. As we see here, the boom in colonial annexations is linked with this rise of monopoly. Finance capitals, as we mentioned before, needs government backing to force colonies into the submission. So this is what we see the Berlin Conference, and all of the colonial history of the 19th and 20th century is dictated by this need of accumulation and coerced in and allied with the state. State has a huge part in allowing and aiding and forcing these big companies to expand. They're kind of the military weapon behind it. As we said before, there's this control of raw materials so that they can control all the aspects of industry. Imperialism, one of its core traits is that it needs as much territory as it can get its hands on, right? Not even established territories where they know there's raw materials, but potential, because there's this desperation that someone else is going to get the upper hand, that you see a complete division territory of the world where these four countries pretty much are diving into every little corner that they can find in order to really bring out as much profit and capital from every single thing that they can. What's the hidden thing behind all this economic policy is violence, it's murder, it's complete destruction of territories. Is what we see in Zionism, it's what we see in all these colonial Algeria, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Cuba, Venezuela, all of these different colonial expenditures which force countries into submission and consequently all their populations. We see very few people getting rich and everyone else being devastated. That's why I also think ecological matters are directly linked with socialism and anti colonial projects, because it is that tie of monopoly, imperialism, and profit as the main motive, which really leads the world to become secondary and tertiary, much like the population in the world that inhabits it. Monopoly necessarily leads to imperialism, as we said. This is kind of in chapter 6. I kind of just 4, 5, and 6, I just put all together. And then Lenin's most famous aspect of the book is the 5 points that he says are foundational and the factors of imperialism. One, as we mentioned before, the concentration of production and capital that leads to monopoly, and thus monopoly playing a decisive role in economic, and I will add, political life. It kind of dictates every aspect of it. Secondly, merging of bank capital with industrial capital. It's the creation of this financial oligarchy which controls the markets. Three, the export of capital versus the export of commodities. As we said before it was a battle of, oh, the best commodity, we needed markets to explore, but now it's also the export of capital, and thus making capital by loans, by all these different methods which these new monopolists have come up with. Four, formation of international capitalist monopolies, dividing the world among themselves. As we saw, the partition of the world, Berlin Conference, these are all examples of that. And five, the territorial division of the world completed. By this desperation to have as much land, raw materials, markets, etc., they divide the world into colonies or dependent countries, as we see here. It's not necessarily a pure control. One example that Lenin puts, for example, for the dependent is Portugal, in which Portugal, even though kind of being politically independent, is still completely submissive to the economic determinations of the UK, for example. Lenin, later on, I believe this is chapter 8, talks about the decay and the stagnation of capitalism at this stage, right? He says that out of free trade, which is kind of this open thing, monopoly comes in, which is its opposite, and fixes prices, right? One thing that monopoly might do is it might undercut everyone, which for a time is beneficial to the consumer, right? I can get this for a much cheaper price than everywhere else. But then what happens? Once the monopoly controls the market, they can then set the price that they want, and no one can say anything because they're the prime holders of everything. What leads out of that is a might, want, or need of technical stagnation. If the monopoly already controls everything, they don't really want innovation per se. And so then they might have a subsidiary which buys patents of new innovations in their industry and pigeonhole them. And so then everyone kind of comes out losing from that. So that also debunks this myth that capitalism leads to more innovation, because once the market is controlled by a few, there's no real want or need for innovation. It's more about control and putting everything down to whatever the cheapest thing is. Also, a thing we see is the immense profit which is accumulated by those who don't participate in production. Bondholders, rentiers, people who participate in the usurping, or shareholders of the stock market, which are not necessarily participating in production. And thus, in the country itself, the economy stagnates, the country becomes a little bit of the playground of the rich. And also, what we see importantly, which Lenin kind of gets going against the Second International, is the stratification of a certain bourgeoisification and elitism within the working class. With these huge profits, obviously someone needs to get paid off. And who gets paid off is a certain sector, the leaders of the trade unions, certain sector of the working class, who justifies imperialism and might even argue, as we see later on, with ultra imperialism, which is this complete fallacy that, oh, will just lead to like one who like kind of peacefully will control everything. And what Lenin says is, with monopoly will have much more violent reactions, and it will lead, and it led to what we see, World War I, because of this tension of accumulation and violent like control by a few. One thing we also see is how by the exporting of industry and also the exporting of capital, we see a huge division between the very rich and everyone else. But also, we see this in a global scale of the core countries and the peripheries, or the global north and the global south. And the global south, who bears the brunt of all of this physically by losing their land, politically, economically. And what we see, even related today, is this increase of immigration of countries that have been destroyed by the tortures of colonialism, which all lead back to this concept of imperialism, which is necessitated by monopoly. All of this concept of controlling is a very capitalist, monopolist doctrine. So, yeah, towards the end, I started running a little bit there, but these are the main concepts. I didn't really touch into chapter 9 and chapter 10, which I highly still recommend. I also just didn't really have a lot of space left, as you might see. But chapter 9 is pretty much a huge roast. If you thought the Drake Kendrick thing was crazy, look into Lenin versus Kautsky. Lenin is pretty much destroying this guy. It's so fun to see, and that kind of left imprint forever. And yeah, as I said, this is just a chill reader's guide. Hopefully, you might have gotten something out of it. I know I certainly did by trying to bring Lenin's thoughts into a little brief summary. There's still a lot that you can get into, all of the data, all of the more nuanced things, but it's not a super long book. It's like 160. So you can, whatever pace you read it at, is definitely a book that's doable. And if you push through some of the more like nitty gritty technical aspects, it's something that is still super relatable today and we can get a lot out of. So, yeah, genius, and I hope you all do well.